Hello, this is Science for Cycle 3, Week 19, and this week marks our beginning of our discussion of probability, which will carry us the last 6 weeks of the year. So a couple of things that I want to mention this week that pertain to the next 6 weeks in total. The first thing is the purpose for discussing probability to such an extent, because I think that it can feel like kind of a long time talking about these concepts, especially for younger kids. And so it's important that we stay focused on that purpose. And the purpose of our discussion of probability is to lay a foundation of these ideas in our students' minds so that as they continue to, in their scientific studies and continue to learn more about the world around them, that it points them to the likelihood of a creator rather than the likelihood of things happening by chance. So as they investigate and see the complexity and the order in the world around them, that they can see that the probability of all of these things coming together by chance is just not believable. So again, each week we want to point them to the fact that there is a creator, and that just the mathematical study of probability itself points us to the logical conclusion that there is a creator. So in that vein, each week you will have a little example of some component of creation that's highlighted. It's from this book, Pearls in Paradise. And so it will highlight just some of the complexity or order in creation around us, in the created world, and lead us further down that discussion of the fact that God created the world in such a complex and amazing way. So for example, this week is honeybees and the little dances that they do to communicate, and just the unlikelihood that those dances could have developed over time, and the greater probability that God instilled these dances in the instincts of honeybees. And so again, you can use these stories in whatever way you think is best with your students, but there will be one for each week. The second piece of information that I want to share that applies to all 6 weeks of probability is that I want you to feel a lot of ownership to make these weeks your own. And what I mean by that is that you know your students by this time. You know what kind of level they can discuss on, how long their attention spans are. You know, you might have really young kids or older kids, and these weeks will vary a lot in how you're going to apply the information for younger and older kids. So feel free, I'll give some ideas in the videos, but also feel free to be creative and omit things or add things or change your discussions to apply to the students in your class. And I'll give you a few little extra experiments at the end that I'll talk about, so that if you do have younger students that maybe tire really quickly of a discussion of probability, or just don't have the math background to talk through the fractions or the mean, median, and mode that we'll talk about, hopefully I'll give you enough things that you can fill the time. So again, please feel the license to make it your own. So let's talk about this week's demonstration. This week we're going to focus on about the simplest level of probability. We're going to talk first about a coin flip. And so we have some kind of large novelty coins as well as regular metal coins or some plastic coins, and you can use whatever you think is best for your class. But to begin to orient your students to the discussion, you can talk about what sides are on the coin, that there's a heads and there's a tails. And then you want to get to the discussion of how many outcomes there are when you flip a coin. So when I flip this coin, this one landed on tails, right? If I flip it again, how likely is it that it will land on tails again? That's what we want to get down to. And so to do that, we want to talk about the number of outcomes. And your students are all bright enough to realize that there are 2 possible outcomes when I flip a coin. It could be heads or it could be tails, right? And if we want to talk about how often we think we're going to flip the coin and it lands on heads, well, we would say, well, that is 1 out of the 2 possible outcomes. And so you can show your class that if we're going to write this mathematically, we would make 2 our denominator, right? And we would say the likelihood, so 2 is the total number of outcomes. And if we want to talk about the likelihood that it will land on heads, that would be 1 out of every 2 times. For younger classes especially, it can be really helpful to visualize this, right? You say 1/2 of the times we expect that our coin is going to be flipped and land on heads. You can also give some silly examples. You can say, how likely is it that I flip this coin and it lands on both heads and tails? Well, that would be 0, right? Out of the 2 outcomes, 0 of the outcomes are that it's going to land on both sides at once. How likely is it that I flip it and it lands completely on its side. Well, with this coin, that's pretty impossible. So I'd say 0 out of 2 as well, right? So you can give those kind of examples to demonstrate that some things are just not, have such low probability that it's pretty much impossible. So then you are going to carry out your kind of demonstration or experiment, and this is one of those areas where you can determine what's best for your class. For younger classes, maybe it looks like using this big novelty coin and all gathering around and drum rolling for each coin toss. For older kids, they've got space in their science journals to write tally marks. So maybe you have each of them flip a separate coin, or maybe you have them get together in pairs and flip the coin. You want to do 12 coin flips, but if each of your students is doing 12 coin flips, then you have a lot more data to talk about. So you can decide what will work best for your student, but for your class. But let's say that I flipped my coin 12 times and wrote down how many times I got heads and how many times I got tails. And I think that the likelihood of getting heads is 1 out of 2, or 1/2, right? And then let's say that I carried out my coin flip and I got 4 heads and I got 8 tails. All right, now I can demonstrate the probability that turned out to be true in my experiment. So I would say that out of my 12 coin flips, 4 of them were heads, right? If you have older students, you can reduce that fraction and you can say 1/3 of my coin flips were heads. So I originally thought my probability of flipping and getting heads would be 1/2, but it turned out to actually be a little bit lower in my actual experiment, right? Not super different, right? So you can talk through what that looks like, and if you have lots of students who've done the coin flips, you can kind of work through each one. What was the probability of heads or tails? If you add all of yours together, does it change the probability? What was the total probability of flipping heads or flipping tails? You could talk through how probable is it that if I flip this coin 12 times, that it would land all 12 times on heads. Probably pretty low, right? And we're going to investigate some of those types of things in future weeks, but it's good ideas to just get started talking about. So then as extensions to your kind of demonstration, particularly if you have older classes who are maybe interested in this, you could bring out a couple of other things. You could talk about a dice, right? How many outcomes are there when I roll a dice? There are 6 outcomes. How likely is it that I would roll a dice and land on 5? Well, it'd be 1/6. How likely is it that I would roll a dice and land on 5 or 2? Well, that'd be 2/6. How likely that it would land on an odd number? That would be 3/6, which would be 1/2. So you can talk about that and even do an experiment with that if you want. You could also talk about a deck of cards that has 52 cards split into 2 different colors and 4 different suits. So you could talk about how likely is it that I reach into a deck of cards at random and pull this exact card, the Jack of Hearts. How likely is it that I reach into the deck at random and pull a black card, or a club, or a heart, or a jack? So you could talk through some of those probabilities. And again, make it your own for your class and for how far you think they're willing to go or comfortable going with the discussion, and how much attention span they have for it. So one other thing that I am going to do is to send along some supplies each week for just a really small little demonstration experiment to add to the end of your time, particularly if you have younger classes who maybe grow a little bit tired of the discussion of probability. And the way that I'm developing these experiments is to coincide with the days of creation. So on the first day of creation, God created earth, space, time, and light. So we're going to do a really simple demonstration experiment focused on the idea of light today. And then next week, we will do one focused on day 2 of creation, and so on and so forth for the last 6 weeks of science. So your only supplies for this experiment are a clear plastic cup and a note card that has an arrow drawn on it. And you are going to hold this note card behind the cup. You might need to give it a little space from the cup to make the experiment work well. And then you're going to just slowly fill this cup with water so that the water covers the arrow. And what you should see is that the appearance of the arrow appeared to change directions when the water began to cover it. And notice the arrow is actually still pointing this way, but when it's behind the water, it looks like it's pointing the other way. So you can discuss with your class that light behaves in an orderly way that follows the order that God created it in the world with. And so this light that is coming and touching my arrow here so that I can see it, the light has to pass through this plastic cup, the water, the plastic cup again, and back out into the air. And as it passes through that water, the water is bending the light or refracting it, which creates this illusion that the arrow has actually changed directions. And so there are lots of ways they can play with this at home or investigate more things about light at home, but that's just one little example of the order with which God created light. And again, we want to draw our students' attentions each week back to this idea of the order of creation that God used in the world as we discuss probability. Thanks.